today, because we're focusing on the Italian case and setting it in this larger sort of thematic, or maybe we should say pedagogy way of thinking about contextualizing fascism, I'm taking the lead, and however, I'm supposed to stop after 10 minutes or so, and then I talk and then go on. But just to remind you of what we did last week, we didn't come in with a pat or even a complicated definition of fascism, because we kind of follow what Paxton has evolved over time as a very wonderful historian, but also in our own way of working and studying, that it was very important to understand the context in which we can see these new movements arising, and they're all over the map, these new movements. Okay, so we emphasize very much the parliamentary systems of Europe, but you can see that they're relatively new, that the notion that we once had that they're always going to become more and more perfect and integrate people, well, we know from 1950s to the 1990s, the 1990s to 2020, that it's not all, it's not smooth sailing. New movements arise. And so what we were very interested in doing is understanding the difficulties that parliaments conceived as big old boys club. And I mean really old boys. Giolitti, who was prime minister down to 1921. He's 84 years old. Still bright as a button, but slower, and that's going to matter. Okay. So we try to think of the parliamentary systems, each with their peculiarities, and all parliamentary systems, mainly the Western, but they're, the ideas spreading, have difficulties, including the masses, representing what they should be representing, and how those people being represented, the conflict with the interests. You can think of the capitalist interests, finance capitalist interests, which don't necessarily, in fact, very little go through the parliament. So there's always going to be conflicts inside and outside. Right? Number one. The second was that this is a period of intensely rising imperialism and nationalism. Okay? And that creates all kinds of clashes, increased militarization, ultimately war, also a very wide and dense thinking about race, hierarchies of race, which brings back old European racism, the anti-Judaism, the anti-Islam, Islamic thinking, anti-Slav thinking, so far as their weird Orthodox sects and so on and so forth, and also the difference of the rights of the master peoples of the West and those other people, colored people, whether they're Asian or black or whatever, yellow, that don't come up, reach the standard of civilization, which is now being diagrammed, written about in the social sciences and mapping and everything in the West. And then finally, war, and that is intensely transforming, as you can imagine. This is the first total war, World War I. It's all over, everywhere. The colonies are brought in with men and with resources. Thousands of, millions of people are killed, combining that too then with the epidemic, which is so much bound up, the Spanish flu bound up with wartime conditions. So it twists and turns parliamentary, it mobilizes people who had not been mobilized before. So you can get a sense that the post-war is going to be a radically different world in which now, how is all of these different work pieces in play going to be settled? All right, background. Now, let's start with, then go to Italy. And I thought, first of all, this word fascism, are you familiar where it comes from? And anybody want to? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It was a symbol of authority from Rome. It was carried by the bodyguards of the consuls.
Yeah.
And it was essentially a symbol of the consuls' authority.
Yeah, right. Sort of the consul's authority, but it had the rods, which were, to bat people around the head. Do something more. We're also bound together with with leather, the sign of the people, kind of the sovereign people, kind of together. right? And then the axe, which is in the middle, that was really a sign of just a power that could be exercised, not necessarily chopping off heads. It meant something higher. And again, you think we have so many Roman signs in the present day. That happens to be on the back of the Roosevelt, I think, dime. I think down to 1945, if you look at the back of our dime, we have a nice fasces on the back, and you can find it all over. I think behind the speaker's head, also in the House of Representatives, when sitting there. The important thing is that in the late 19th, because as a symbol of the authority of the people, it was used in Italy in the late 19th century. That word first by peasants in the South, in Italian South, of something called these sort of fasci. For social justice, they're looking for a word that wasn't party, bond, it's sort of like Bund or, grouping. In fact, I think the story of my family is my grandfather was in the fasci, so socialist, Freemason anyway, anti-clerical, Republican, and on May Day he hit the mayor of the town on his head with his clarinet and was told to, out of there. This is in 1899. Nice family lore. But anyway, the important thing is that this idea of fasci then is bonds. It becomes introduced as an anti-party movement by Mussolini, deliberately, because he's coming out of the socialist tradition. Okay, scientifically organized party using a German model, does everything, tries, builds people's houses at a sort of YMCA type structure like this. It has a marvelous newspaper, youth groups, and so on and so forth. It's like a state within a state. He is and more into being part of Parliament, that parliamentary cretinism, which an anarchist socialist like him denounced. So during the war, he breaks away from the socialists. They want neutrality. He wants to be part of the, go into the war in the name maybe of revolution. Break the system apart by going into the war. And as Parliament closes down, for the duration of the war, he sets up this committee called the Fasci combat, who are going to lobby to go into the war. And he uses then his newspaper. He founds his own newspaper called The People of Italy, and it begins to rattle around many, many different kinds of ideas, but mainly the idea of going into the war, being patriotic, being part of this national bloc, usually conservatives who will go into the war. And in 1919, in October, to sort of emphasize really for the first time what fascism is, he says the fascist emblem signifies unity, force, and justice. So one of those slogans. Okay, unity, force, and justice. He doesn't say unity, justice, and force. So you'd have justice, and then you need the force to keep the justice, to keep the unity. These fascists, people, Mussolini begin to use the concepts that are available to them and to start to change them. That included the term National Socialism. Mussolini didn't speak of National Socialism, but he easily could have. And how do you put socialism together with nationalism? Okay, couldn't you do that in some way or shape or form? So you'd have socialism and justice, but you'd have nationalism. Everything should be subordinated to the nation. That was probably one of his ideas, at least when he wanted to enter into the war. Okay. Now, if we look at the founding moment of the Fasci, di combattimento, that's March 1919. Unfortunately, these dates matter, not in the abstract, but I'm not going to afflict you with them because things happen. What's meeting at the first Fasci, a rented auditorium, not as nice as this, a motley 100 or so followers, maybe 10 women, heretics of all of the heretical movements of the time. So they're ex-anarchists, some anarcho-syndicalist trade union organizers, ex-socialists, futurists, combat RDT, that is these crack troops who would throw themselves with grenades and knives against a lot of drink in them, drugs against the German lines, bohemian types, a businessman or two who sponsored Mussolini's newspaper. Some of them, not all, war veterans, okay? And Mussolini at that point is batting around how he can enter politics again because he's been kicked out of the socialist movement, which he had led very effectively in terms of his own personal ambitions, and because also he was a very gifted journalist, so brought in the new journalism to Italy, and because he was violent. He was a violent man, and that was very appealing to some of the young, to be able to stop the trains as they were bringing troops to the Libyan war. That was important. Being arrested in the piazza as he supported the war, and so on. So at that time, just to give you again this idea of the what charitably could call the third position between two opposite poles, above the divergent positions in the left and among right-wing parties. So he's not referring to the right, he's not referring to the left, he's sort of referring, how can we position ourselves to capture the kind of essence of what people feel is so horrible, but anti-socialist, that's his main thing. So the mishmash, he says, that will bring this will to power of the new man. They style themselves as the new men. They're coming out of the war, out of what Mussolini called a trichocracy. We would like to be aristocrats and democrats, conservatives and liberals, reactionaries and revolutionaries, legalists and illegalists, depending on the circumstances of time, place, and environment. Now, you could say, fine, he's an opportunist. But the one point is majorly anti-socialist. And to all of those businessmen, aristo-bourgeois, the king, the pope, middle classes who were scared to death of radicalism, who thought that he was an anarchist and still could be an anarchist, disruptive, smelly, dirty collars, he didn't look like a normal bourgeois politician. He made clear by his actions and his men. One of the first things they did after they founded these fasci is one of the men, not Mussolini, he was working in this newspaper, one of these heroes from the war who was fearless and violent, heads a group that invades Avanti, the socialist newspaper, the sort of sign of the uplift of the working masses, of the civilization, the high level of culture of the people, and burns it down, killing 4 people. This is in Milan, well-policed, orderly bourgeois city. It'd be like, I can't even imagine, where that could be in New York City. And that's the first of 3 times they would be burned down Avanti, which would rebuild until they took power. Okay, so what we want to explore today is how this ragtag movement, which is searching for a place to go, gradually is able to collect and integrate now a following such that it is going to be taken on board by the elite, by a very conservative establishment, by liberal elites who, in the figure of Giolitti, Giovanni Giolitti, can't quite think of who would be the parallel to him, a liberal, he doesn't believe in thugs. Law and order, the Constitution, even integrating socialists and the Catholics. So what happens? Okay, so let me just stop there for a moment, and then what I want to do is explore today, wonder, belief, horror, how this unprepossessing anti-movement transforms itself in just 2 years into a vast mass-based party militia, discipline, people marching properly in uniform, guns, very hard to get in Italy. You had to have them from the war raids on the army, to being accepted as the sole party of government by 1925, 1926. And I want to highlight here the play between legal and illegal activity, being parliamentary, doing parliamentary politics, elections, and what the Italians called squadrismo, the bully boys, the thugs, armed with performing military operations. And then, very briefly, we want to go on in the second part to understand how Mussolini governed, Right. And third, we want to explore that third phase in the 30s when the fascist party leading Italy becomes radicalized and begins to totally disrupt the system, the liberal system. Okay, let me stop here. We'll have questions, then I'll start on the first part. Any?
I would just make a couple of comments. I think
Sure.
the very name fascism, the newness of it, just like National Socialism, the official name of the party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, full of contradictions, but something startlingly new. And that's one of the things that these two movements did that really captured attention. They just didn't say we're young conservatives or we're, more militant liberals. They developed a new concept. The other thing, and I think you'll probably talk about this, very soon, why was it that liberal Italy could not restabilize itself after World War I in the way that a mixture of some liberals, social democrats, and Catholics stabilized a liberal republic in Germany? What is it about the crisis or Italy that made that not possible?
Mm-hmm. Good. That's great. Yeah.
I just how much was Mussolini exceptional in splitting from the Socialist Party in this way, or was the party itself splintered?
Yeah, that's an important question, which we can deal with in a separate. One line of left-wing historiography blames the left. Why did it split so far to the left? Why couldn't it stay unified, provide a unified front? Why couldn't it fight better, resist better? Why didn't it try to collaborate more with the government? With, let's say, Giolitti offering itself as a part of a coalition with the Catholics and with the liberals, even if it meant, abandoning its program. Let's see if we can go ahead. Okay, so let me go in.
But I would say that if one wants to talk about socialist divisions, one has to go back to what you started at talking about Mussolini, which is the way socialist movements almost everywhere became patriotic during the war. They, in a kind of embrace suddenly not being marginalized, not being considered enemies, and then split over the question of supporting the war. And then there's this little issue of the Russian Revolution and an alternative model that, further divided socialists.
So, to start out again, I tend to look what's going on in this Italian, this nation. And of course, yes, it's relatively recently unified, but that's most of it. And it had serious economic, social, political problems before World War I. The idea of the elite was, we go into the war, we're going to get all these goodies from the secret treaty, we're going to get pieces of the Balkans, we're going to get, all of Libya. They're going to recognize maybe that we should be able to do some deal over Tunisia with the French. So they're going to the war that somehow we're going to make this worth it. We'll push off revolution. And then 4 years of war, 650,000 men dead, probably a couple 100,000 civilians, because part of the war is fought in the mountainous region between Austro-Hungarian Empire and the state budget, but above all, serious problems with it. The army command, which is ultimately responsible to the king. So there was a delegitimizing of the state over the course of the war, as well as this growth of patriotism, but no longer directed at the monarchy. In fact, there was even conspiratorial forces within the monarchy, the king's cousin, who was suggesting that he be removed. So, but I think that word polycrisis, which my colleague Adam Tooze perhaps overuses and perhaps under defines, at least gives some sense that we're not talking about a crisis. We're talking about one of these sets of crises which all intertwine so that it becomes very difficult for any single person or movement to get kind of perspective, even though you have incredibly intelligent minds. One thinks of Antonio Gramsci, one thinks of Mussolini himself, who are trying to make sense of it, and in the process, developing new movements and new ways of operating to address it. But just to think, all right, there's in the background, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 terrorizes the entire West, right? People are living with terror, going to Versailles and saying, how do we deal with Lenin? How do we keep him back there, push Russia back, contain Russia? And what do we do with our own Reds? It's a time of Red Scare. Okay? And at the same time, this has enormous influence. There are revolutions, there are new communist parties being formed, the Italian one in 1920, okay? Breaking away from the socialists. Okay? Okay. There is a still immediate memory of the war. Italy is a defeated victor. Okay, that means what do you do with all of the veterans being demobilized very quickly? How do you pay for them? How do you pay for the widows, the orphans, and all of the casualties? It's a huge, huge problem. How do you integrate them in the labor force? Okay. There's inflation. There's a soaring cost of bread in particular, which had been imported, wheat, from the United States during the war because Italy wasn't growing enough. Okay. There's a question of huge war debts to the United States, which mean that it's very hard to get Wall Street capitalists to invest in Italy, also because there's so many strikes going on, so much disorder, and eventually the fear, too, of whether these fascists are communist or anarchist or whatever. Then there's the Versailles Treaty, which is supposed to put back order, and the nationalists in Italy say that we were screwed. Wilson comes along, he says, oh no, we want Yugoslavia to have a port, and so Italy won't get Fiume, this port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is Italian-speaking. Back in Interland, no, but most of Fiume is. And this then creates an extraordinary momentum, the great history called The Rise of Fascism, which is by a former communist, Angelo Tasca, written in 1938 when things started to look really bad. Spain, the tipping toward fascism. He starts out his book about this revolution coming from the Adriatic. And what he's talking about is this crazy, not so crazy, crazy like a fox, poet, warrior, D'Annunzio, immensely popular, immensely well-known, who has taken a group and has mounted a coup d'etat in Fiume. Okay, you say, okay, big deal. But it's a huge deal because that means Italy hasn't been able to do its duty, right, as a normal nation state, to keep peace there, so that this piece of former Habsburg Empire can be given over. D'Annunzio, okay, sometimes called the first fascist, writes his own constitution, he puts in divorce, they've got drugs. It's an incredible scene for about a year and a half, okay, where so many people, okay, middle classes mainly, women and men, come globally, come to see this, the first, if you want, sort of utopia, okay, which Mussolini begins to claim as, that could be fascist. Not at first, because he doesn't like the ideas being stolen and so on, but eventually. Very important because it breaks the Constitution. It violates D'Annunzio and others' oath to the army. Okay? It's casts dirt on the capacity of the liberal elite to abide by the treaties. Very important moment. Okay? Okay. Then there's a strike wave of 1919, the Red Wave, which has the workers coming out, you say normally, huge strikes. The big businesses or former war industries saying, asking Giolitti to send in, the military, as they had used to do, in order to put down the order. He's saying, hey, work it out yourselves. This is economy. We're liberals. And then big business started to say, we need some law and order here. Right? trade union busting, maybe gangs. In the countryside, there is indeed, that's what's happening. As peasants begin to occupy the land, right? The states which have not been divided up, they're veterans. And there, where there's less policing going on, and you're not in Milan, where the bourgeoisie would detest if you sent thugs out to beat up workers in their own homes, which are adjacent to the bourgeois neighborhoods, you get the beginning of these thugs going out to the country around the harvest time when there's strikes and beginning to kill and burn out socialists, kill socialist leaders and burn down the organizations. Okay. Now, if you look at it, here briefly, the elections, our system is working in a way. I mean, the parliamentary system is going on. So what you're seeing at the beginning is the parliamentary system is going on. Mussolini runs for office in the first elections, 1919, sorry, we got this up here, September 1919. He runs as a deputy in Milan on his program, which is a wild Republican, vote for women, tax big business, war profits, and so on. It's kind of Republican all over the map, but what we'd call in Italy a radical program. Okay? And he gets only a couple thousand votes, and it seems like his movement's over. That's it. Gone. He's gone. Okay? But at the same time, the fascists in the countryside are beginning to move, and so there's a growing gap between Mussolini, his newspaper, right, speaking to a bigger public, new media, very important, and this violence going out in the countryside. Second elections, local elections, you think, what does that matter? It mattered hugely because in local elections in November 1920, the socialists conquer about 2,000, about a quarter of all the towns of Italy, including big ones, Milan, Turin, and so on and so forth. And at that point, the fear of Bolshevism, of the workers, just becomes enormous and capillary and local. And the squads begin to swell, okay? Especially when they see the sorts of things, this is important, that socialists are doing. Spending this town budget, which should get the permission of the prefect, to deprivatize the water system, or to purchase breakfast snacks for worker children or books. And amazing. When I went and looked at what they were protesting locally, it was things like that. And to see the red flag, so these symbols of this, what they call this arrogant working class party, these illiterates, these beasts, these Bolshevik beasts, that, the imagery of them eating children was created a kind of great terror of the left, and the movement swelled. At that point, Mussolini is being pressed. He's got his newspaper absolutely key, blah, 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 and we have as well this violence going out around in the countryside with more and more people being killed. Now we're not talking about huge numbers. We're talking about 3 here and 1 here, somebody beat up here, somebody being forced to drink castor oil there to humiliate him, a socialist with long beard having his beard cut, a woman raped. I mean, this kind of odd persona violence, which in Italy has huge effects, as it does in the United States as well. The bodies are kind of very, very important. So you don't have to think of thousands of people being put in concentration camps. You have to think this locally and what then these funerals are like, and how the police try to react or are incompetent because the men jump in trucks and run away, and the police don't have trucks or don't have proper trucks, and so on and so forth. So you can see this is now this society where locally you're getting more and more of this violence. At the center, the liberals changing, unable to create a coalition. No matter how clever they are, they've got Catholics, which are conservative, with some democratic. They're divided soul, Democrats and conservatives. The Socialist Party, it's got a more radical group, it's got a more reformist group, liberals and conservatives. So even the most clever are not able to break this, deal with this problem. How do you get a governing coalition? Which, in the ideal world, we see that after the World War in Europe would be, well, Germany, sometimes you get these grand coalitions, Catholic, but the Socialists will support it. In Italy, you get all these kind of groups of the Catholic, mainly Catholic, liberal, and so on. Democrats, they're all basically conservative. They'll make a coalition and then eventually bring in the Socialists. But that simply was becoming impossible in Italy. The church and the Pope, there are all sorts of issues made it very difficult. So Giolitti, in power, coming back, rotating in and out because he's not able to keep a coalition together, he steps down, the king appoints somebody else who's not inept, can't do it. He comes back in and he says, okay, we've got to go to elections again because we don't have a majority. All right. Okay. We'll bring in the fascists and they'll behave because Mussolini wants to be recognized. He wants to come to Rome. He wants to be in parliament. Many of them do think in a parliamentary way. They'll get to Rome, they'll make the revolution through parliament. So he's brought in to this electoral list, sort of a great list. They're all on the same ballot. And you basically go in and scribble. And as a result, okay, his list doesn't do that well, but 14 fascists are elected to parliament. It doesn't do well. The Socialists advance and the Catholics advance. So he failed to widen his liberal base, and now the fascists are in parliament and they're legitimate. They've been legitimated by the political system as partners. So from there on, you've got this two paths. On the one hand, in parliament, you've got their obstructionism, their denunciation of the socialists when they file briefs to get the violence attended to. On the other hand, in the northern provinces, wherever there is strong socialist movement, mainly in the north, some in the boot around Bari, some around Syracuse and Sicily, that's where you've got strong working class organizations, this terrible violence. And this comes to a head then in the summer of 1922, okay, when Giolitti is thinking of stepping back in. The left is aghast and some elements are calling for a general strike. That makes the fascists even more fierce and willing to attack them, devastate, march through, and actually have coup d'etat in all the major cities. In other words, seize, militarily, town hall in Milan, Turin, and so on and so forth. This before the March on Rome. Okay. Again, one more minute just to give a sense. At that point, the decision-making process becomes once more Giolitti's, or the king's doing it. Let's bring Mussolini, try him out as prime minister. Okay? Even if he has minority deputies. Once he's prime minister, he will become integrated into the system. So the logic of this arrogance, of this conservatism, is that this Mussolini will be brought into the system, and his deputies, there are only 14, will have to have a coalition with conservatives, with nationalists, with Catholics even, not with socialists, maybe even later with socialists, and we will create a government of national unity. Here we go. Right. So, March on Rome takes place anyway. Mussolini is adamant that, his major military men are adamant that he do it. And he's a smart enough politician to recognize he has to do it then, October. Otherwise, Giolitti's going to come back. And if Giolitti comes back, the possibility is that he will create a coalition without the deputies and manage to stabilize. That's, I think, where I would see some interesting possibilities for stabilization. 1922, if you look around Europe, 22 is sort of when things either go really bad or, they begin to kind of, there's a political settling as the economy sort of perks up. Instead, the king right? Refuses to call out the military to stop the March on Rome, which is basically a very violent show of force. But Mussolini himself is invited with all the proper protocol, with all of the permissions from the elites, to form up a cabinet himself. Okay, I'll stop here. So we still have parliamentary government as of October 1922. It's clearly been brought about both through this legal channels, getting the acceptance of the parliamentary system, the elites of the parliamentary system, at the same time with this extraordinary violence, which is being denounced mainly by the socialists, not well covered at all in the national press, not especially well covered, I think, either in the, let's say, the press abroad either, because it was very sort of hard to pick up on, local Italian politics. And, Okay.
I think if you look at this kind of crisis that's going on in Germany in these first years after World War I, which is in many ways exactly this kind of multifaceted crisis, in certain ways even worse. The monarchy has collapsed, the Kaiser has fled, they've drafted this new, quite on paper, very liberal Weimar Constitution. But there's a lot of still opposition to it. But I think there are a couple of things that make it possible for Germany to overcome the crisis in this first period of 1919 to the 1923 beer hall putsch of Hitler. You still can have a working coalition, which became harder in Italy. This weird coalition of social democrats, Catholics, and free Democrats. They did hang together. They managed or mismanaged the hyperinflation, which I'll say a little bit more about next time, but ultimately they did get it under control. But there was also, what struck me from your description, so much less on the ground, both militancy from peasants and workers, factory occupations, land seizures, which really ramp up the terror of elites, and much, much more squad violence. Wasn't that there wasn't violence in Germany, but it was sort of more coordinated by old military and demobilized soldiers, the Free Corps, and some who hadn't been in World War II. And they tried to actually stage a putsch in 1920. It doesn't work. Hitler tries a putsch in 23. It doesn't work. The right is sort of all over the place. There's no one party. Hitler's party was very small. There's nothing comparable to the way Mussolini manages to very quickly build a quite extensive movement and realize that trying to putsch is not going to be the way to power, that you have to mix kind of terror and electoral politics. Hitler learns it much later. He learns it after the 23 putsch, when he's sitting in Landsberg prison for a year and writing Mein Kampf and thinking, well, if I really want to come back, what do I have to do?
Thoughts? Yeah.
I guess I'm just having trouble with, because it seems like Mussolini is building this big movement, and there's, of course it's contradictory, but I'm having trouble nailing down what exactly the movement is, because, you have this electoral thing that's, essentially radical liberalism. I mean, votes for women, anti-clericalism, this, that, and the other thing. And meanwhile, they're beating up strikers and, union organizers. And I'm just sort of wondering, is there a top-level syncreticness between those two things, or how does that kind of work?
I think your question is terribly well taken. So, first of all, in that Mussolini has, the project has changed very significantly from 1919. So when he understands, and coterie around him, that there's no space for Vote for Women, for that radical liberal program, he begins to move over to a nationalist with some socialistic elements. Okay, so it would be that the party is organized as a party militia. Right? That means organized. Now, those militia are not supposed to be running around. They're supposed to be organized as a militia of, for national security, which in the Italian context would be like a national guard. Italy did not have a national guard. So it would be coming and saying, Italy, for various reasons, Garibaldi there was no National Guard tradition. This will be the National Guard, but it comes at a point where it's responsible to the National Socialist Party. Right? So you're the kind of, it will bring security, which before had only been guaranteed by the army, which put the army in a terrible position. So you start to think about the United States. What's the National Guard, what the local police are, how they, who's in charge. But it forces you to think the specificity there. Right? So this militia, because it's being organized by people like Teruzzi, who is probably major. That's what majors do: is they organize the front, make sure everybody's doing their thing, that they know where the guns are, and the grenades, and the maps, and so on and so forth. They have a full-fledged national army by 1922, which is capable of getting trucks, stealing the kerosene and gasoline from the police, and go on these long escapades, which burn out all of the towns, let's say, in Romagna, from Ferrara to the sea. Okay? Just burn them out, chase away the socialists. And the police they don't have the equipment, if they even wanted to be called out. It's very dangerous. So it's very, very important. Okay? So the question is, it's the party all the time worrying. Having inside of it factions. Okay, one says, go through Parliament, and means working with businessmen to reassure them, working with the prefects, who are like the appointed governors of each state. Waltz were appointed by a mixture of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. That person is responsible and knows what's going on. Get their cooperation, so that turn a blind eye. That's very, very important. Key, the prefect. Make sure that the military, are not going to be offended, trampled on. Mussolini does that by appointing 4 quadrivirs, and 2 of them are military men. One particularly a much beloved, not very good general, who immediately, sort of assuaged all, aristocrats and so on. That he was a good man and part of this, part of this group. So it's very tactical, but the strategy is not clear. It's to take power, and that's just take power. How do we take power? But the avenues seem to be the 2. Parliament, you have to win elections. There aren't going to be any elections for the future. But in Italy, you can by being appointed prime minister, with the idea that you have particular power, political power, not military power. And on the other hand, this huge militia organization, and as they have success, you begin to get in more and more, intellectuals or people of great competence, who think, the new Italy returned to its grandeur, getting rid of the alien Bolsheviks, subversive, anti-national. So there is more and more legitimation as the prospects of some other solution become less. And the left, even it has great minds and substantial organization, which is being broken down, is dividing about what to do. And that's an old argument. It divides first between the maximalist socialists, who basically say we got to get out there and fight, and we've got to be intransigent, not cooperate with Giolitti to defend. A kind of middle grouping, which is in Parliament and is trying to use Parliament to advance, and maybe in communication with Giolitti, conceivably pulled off. And then the new Communist Party, which even if it has deputies, Gramsci's eventually a deputy, I think he's elected in 24 with another election, it basically, it has the model of the Soviets in its head. And that's very fine, but only for big city like Turin, or which was roughly compared to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, or Milan, another big city with factories. So the whole logic of the big industry, that's the problem of the peasants. How do you organize them in communists? So
Somebody
it's
had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking about how they had this huge military formation. They must have needed money. Where were they getting their funding for that?
Oh, where they funding? It's a question that's not. Well, they steal stuff from uniforms. Women make them, and they create all these fascist women groups. Sew up the uniform.
Self-funded.
Yeah. Self-funded. No, I shouldn't say that at all. Very good question. No, they're funded by big landlords. The trucks, the gasoline, the guns. So there's a lot of funding from what they call the landlords. Sorry, that's in New York. Not the right term in New York City. The big estate owners, the modern estate owners, not the landlords, the estate owners, especially the large estates, very modern, and they use them as strike breakers, scabs, and they're willing to. And then the funding, I think, is generated basically, around uniforms and food and so on and so forth to, very, very, very local. They're probably starting to sell party cars, but that doesn't do it. Mussolini himself was heavily funded by industrialists who wanted Italy to join the war on the side of France. That was where he got because the newspaper had to be funded. But industrialists were funding the newspaper. That was the most expensive thing.
I mean, one of the things you get, Mussolini and the fascists begin this model of the sort of private army affiliated with the party. Mm-hmm. And you get a situation in Germany in the 1920s where every political party has its paramilitary organization, mm-hmm. That is there to, enforce certain things, to engage in violence, to fight with the opponents. And, it's funded by the party. However the parties get their funds, you get some of what you have, the women will make the uniforms, and party dues will help fund, the Red Fighters League or the Stahlhelm or whatever. But in France, you get some of this as well. It's a peculiar, something that's very different from the much more autonomous and voluntaristic kinds of violent groups like, the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and that whole, the kind of equivalent in this country isn't directly linked to the Republican Party. These were all directly linked to the parties and really gave us kind of, violent edge to politics.
Because you think that many of them are veterans.
Yeah.
Okay? But, they're brought back in and the problem with training, I got that from Grazia, difficult, to reform your units. So, the veteran element is there. Especially if you think about, the way the Trumpist movement funds things, with all these sales of this and that and the other thing that she does. This sort of interesting ways of American Barker.
He funds his own law fees, I think, by selling his Bibles and whatever.
But also you might just sort of think, okay, so the U.S. constitutes a two-party system, and this is a very different structure. So Mussolini is brought in to form a cabinet, only 14 deputies out of probably about 300, and therefore he's going to have to do a coalition.
Yeah.
And what has always been argued for, let's say, the United States, was that if you have a two-party system, it's very difficult to have that kind of formation of a whole new party, which was typical in the European framework, also in Latin America, where you get these, populist parties, which are very large, and which cut in and they get tied to the trade unions, and then you bring in part of the wealth and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back for a second to the question of the left, which you did talk about
Yeah.
a little bit. But it's strange to me. The left has, you would think, an enormous head start. They have massive organizations, they have parliamentary representation, they have newspapers. The Bolshevik Revolution is wind at their back. New parties form. Mussolini and his people have 100 people in the room. He gets 2,000 votes. How is it possible that the left, I know you talked about the divisions in the left, still they're so much more massive than this nascent fascist movement. Why does the left fail?
Well, the working class doesn't have any power on its own except its organization. And then there's a significant difference between its organization and the workplace in society with respect to upper classes. And then with respect to government. I mean, the whole structure which prevents them from having arms, or which treats the strikes as illegal, or when there's a fight between a fascist and a socialist, punishes the socialist for being attacked rather than the fascist for being attacking. So, in these structures, the parties offer a kind of protection, and that was something that Tosca noticed. It's sort of very sad around these castles, these fortresses of the left, because if in the Lower East Side, you had everything. It was like a utopia. You had schools and kindergartens and women's groups and soup kitchens, and then with the elections of 1920, books, and public, make water system and electric system public, and all of that, in the Lower East Side, when the rest is going about its dirty capitalist business, and that was the structure of socialism, and anthropologically. The problem is then, if you're in parliament, right, you have to have a majority, and you have to have your prime minister in order to pass legislation. That's the nature of it. And they are a plurality, they're not a majority, because it's not a two-party system, so it's not a left and a right. It's not like Labour and Conservatives in Britain. That'd be what. Or in France, you have this very large radical party, and you have the Socialists and then the Conservatives. So the radicals and the Socialists in France, I think they're together in 1923, very important moment with veterans coming in, 1923, 24, very sort of a national front that's organized. And then very, very important in 1935, 36, to defend themselves against the far right, the Popular Front. But that means a radical party, which is fairly broad, plus socialists. That's where a strong defense is created. In Spain, oh dear, it splits horribly, the Civil War. The left, socialists, communists, anarchists, syndicalists, and then these forces of the right in Parliament. And that conservatives moves everything out of Parliament into the military and the militia. So the forces of order move outside of Parliament. Say, okay, you control Parliament. Well, we control the streets. We control the military, which leads them to this coup. So,
but I think in sort of longer term, the socialists in Europe, by and large, unlike the Bolsheviks, did not have a real strategy for seizing power. The mainstream view in the German Social Democratic Party before World War I was articulated by Karl Kautsky, who said, we'll wait for the contradictions of capitalism to ripen and sort of fall, like apples from a tree, and we'll inherit it. There were those who opposed it, but they were a minority. when 1918 came and the monarchy collapsed and the communists were in danger of proclaiming a communist republic in Berlin, the Social Democrats stepped in and proclaimed a liberal republic. But part of the people in the party said, my God, how could you do this? We're not ready. They were timid about making a bourgeois liberal revolution. So I think part of it is a kind of timidity. And isn't there a criticism of, the occupation of the factories, but then what do you do when you've occupied them and then kind of ultimately retreating and then you're without a strategy?
No, and it's a sort of a huge problem of worker politics and how it can operate. In Italy, in case, the beauty, the plus is it was not just industrial workers, but to an unusual degree, this working salaried peasantry, which was highly organized. So you got two very different constituencies, but both very well organized. So and bringing a lot of progress in the period between 1900. Which was terribly resented. So it wasn't as if, and that resentment comes when there is this moment of activism, and the activism, it doesn't coordinate between the factory union level and the political level. You have this extra parliament, and that's very important. And then just one last thing, and the timing then is off. So you've got this red wave, right? And at that moment, the parties splitting and not sure how to lead it to the next stage. And then when that subsides, the fascists are coming in. So in effect, the resistance and the élan of the working class movement is already dropped significantly by the time the fascists are on the rise. And,
You mentioned that in Italy, the rise of fascism was a result of the militant labor movement and socialism.
Can you speak up a little?
You mentioned that the rise of fascism in Italy was a reaction to the militant socialism and worker movement in Italy, as opposed to in Germany. So why was it much more militant in Italy versus in Germany, where you said it wasn't quite as militant? Or what was the difference between the two?
well,
Can I add to that? Did the other political parties have their own militias too?
no, in Italy, good gracious, no. I mean, these were very old, men with, king ponies, and I mean, it was a very antique kind of society. Of liberals, and it was true also of the conservatives. There was a national, very sort of small nationalists, new nationalists, neoconservatives, and they brought a lot of brain power, and they would merge with the fascists after Mussolini came to power, and be a very important source of knowledge about Italy's place in the world. Okay? But the militia, I'm sorry, and then you're right, the nationalists did have blue shirts, with D'Annunzio. They had their, but they were often subordinate too, and they were a new party as well. So I guess it doesn't, the problem is it sounds, Mussolini captures all of this thunder. Because of also his background. Hitler doesn't come out of the socialist movement. Mussolini does, and many of his men have also that experience of organizing under socialism. They know how to organize unions. Teruzzi was in the army. He knows how to organize militia. So they're bringing in capacities, which is very, very, very important to taking power, and then more capacities to draw up legislation and to think through projects. That's that's something that's important too, and tends to be underestimated. They think of Mussolini as a buffoon. I mean, Italy in the late 19th century was, if you want to look for logic, reasoning about how elites should turn over so that they could really have power. It's in the area of Switzerland, Germany, southern Germany, and Italy. There seems to be lots of thinking about how you have new politics, and more certainly than in the United States and Britain. Okay, there's a lot of thinking about new politics. So as is more successful, it becomes more legitimate. More the prospect is, if you're somebody who thinks, oh, wow, I want to be a player, you go in with him rather than, and even move away from the socialists. There were those who moved away from the socialists toward the fascists, seeing, if we want a revolution, it's not going to come from the socialists, it's going to come from the fascists. And we're going to have, in the end, some sort of national socialism where, you organize workers and the business people all in organizations where they'll work together in the national interest. Was that,
I'd be fascinated to hear how big that socialist to fascist pipeline actually was, but my question was actually, I guess, retrospectively, it's very easy for us to feel like what an idiot Giolitti was, that he thought that he could, you could tame the fascists by bringing them in. So too, I think we see the same in Germany, where it's like, oh, Hindenburg, what a buffoon, to think that you can bring these guys in and that they're not going to do something more radical. I guess though, sort of trying to resist that, like, hindsight is 2020. I'm trying to understand, like, why actually didn't that work?
Okay.
I.e., we know Mussolini is like a super opportunist and is, willing to adapt to whatever to be in power. We know, like, liberal democracy, history has certainly proven that liberal democracy is fine for capitalists and for, capital accumulation. Some would even argue maybe better than fascism in certain ways. It's more stable, yada, yada. So I guess, like, why wasn't Mussolini's sort of tamed once he was brought into government? Is that about the base of the movement? Is it, yeah.
Really, absolutely right question to segue into the next. So, absolutely, why not? Why wouldn't you bring him in? He loved it. He loved the legislating. He got in. He formed a quite remarkable early coalition, which included Catholic and conservative nationalists and some technicians, good people, economists. The first thing they did was austerity, crush the unions, get Italy prepared so it can have a good American capitalist investment, which arrives in 1924-25, and along with the renegotiation of the debt. So you get big bunches of capital being brought into Italy and new deals about oil and petroleum. And what's more, they agree, most of this parliament, that Italian electoral law is bad. In other words, you can't get a good majority. So Mussolini has just been passing decree laws, hundreds of decree laws, building a train station here, building an aqueduct there, all going through quite easily because he doesn't it's all ruling by decree, executive decree. It's great, king signs everything off. And the main one that a lot of question about is the militia becomes the national militia. Accepted, it's a decree. The king is supposed to swear an oath to Mussolini, not to the king. But the idea is National Guard. Finally, we have a National Guard. This makes us a real bourgeois nation, like France and other places. National Guards. Okay, United States. So the problem is when the electoral law is transformed, which says, okay, now in Parliament, whoever gets the plurality of votes, 40%, will get 2/3 of the seats. Even if they get 37%, they'll get 2/3 of the seat. Very common laws, authoritarians make. Right? So you can have a working majority. This happens. But you've got still some dissenters, and this is the figure of Matteotti and a legalist who says, no, we first have to check through that there's not been any incidents of ballot stuffing and violence and so on before we register the vote. And he makes a long speech denouncing Italy as if it were a banana republic like Mexico. And Mussolini's men make the mistake of killing him, kidnapping him to teach him a lesson. He struggles and he's killed. And everybody knows. So the regime almost falls on that. What do? He has the country, all of the liberal press in Britain, hysterics. Mussolini, Matteotti's very well known, English speaking. He'd been writing for The Guardian, on Mussolini's corrupt deals with Sun Oil Company, an American company, and he was denouncing fascism. So this was that movement that nobody expected, thought that he's going to have now a parliamentary majority that would allow him to be an authoritarian, keep passing all these degrees, which were basically restoring capitalism. And instead, there's this terrible crisis. Mussolini is shocked into ulcers, can't operate, pulled up by his famous lover, Margherita Sarfatti. But above all, the king doesn't know how to act, right? Whether just to bide his time, rather than recalling Mussolini, say we're going to put somebody else in, perfectly normal. And above all, then the militia comes in and says, you act, Mussolini, or we're going to throw you out. We're going to get rid of you. Who knows? You act, you say you're going to keep going, king be damned, right? Opposition be damned, press be damned, okay? Army be damned, and he does. And he finds that the army supports him still, the king, that they much prefer a known authoritarian to the unknowns of a return of socialism, of anarchy, of chaos. So that pushing on is key. Once that happens, January 3rd, 1925, Italy is in effect a dictatorship because the parliamentary occupation, parliament has left the hall in protest, and they basically just close it down, and it will operate from then on as a kind of a rubber stamp, pending the moment in the future, which eventually happens, that it will be eliminated altogether, and they'll create this kind of corporate structure. So that, sort of the point at which I wanted to start. So it's fascinating. There's no, and at this point we were talking, there's no moment where you can say, hey, it's smooth. These are processes, political processes, and it's very, very difficult for authoritarians to become more moderate. But that's Robert Paxson calls it. You could become more radical, or you can have a kind of entropy, and you turn in, and that's an interesting problem. Do dictators give up? But anyway, we've got a long way to go before that. I mean, that movement is very important. This reaction to big changes, and so the 25 moment is more key than I used to think in terms of the decision, to get rid of Parliament. Now, if we move on, I know.
I just want to say one more thing about this, which is that it's probably less surprising that the elites imagined that they could kind of tame Mussolini. He hadn't written his whole program, in sort of,
Right.
many hundreds of nearly incomprehensible turgid prose. But, the Germans should have known better, having seen what happened in Italy. But in both cases, one should not underestimate the class arrogance of these societies that were coming into the interwar period. The elites had absolute confidence that they were better, that they knew better, that they knew how to manipulate power, and that Mussolini and Hitler were a kind of riffraff who came to have surprising success but could be kept in their place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There, I think the initial sort of at what point do the elites start to speak of him as a genius? And there are these. I'm trying to think of who would be the equivalent. It's hard to think of the equivalent here. Sort of, like a Cheney figure in the Bush, who was actually subaltern rather than thinking he was so superior. He would have begun to think that Mussolini was a genius. There was that kind of, so somebody very well drilled in foreign policy with ideas of, maybe Wolfowitz got these figures who have an idea as the best and the brightest of how the state could go. But by 1924, there were figures who were starting to say, this man really, he gets it. He's a workaholic, he's writing, he's got very smart advisors, like this figure Sarfatti, this Jewish woman lover, high intellectual, and she's feeding all this stuff into him. So he's a person who's working to stay abreast of a very complicated political system. I mean, this is important. But in the crisis, he's nothing. He's completely, and it's the forces that say, okay, you do it or you're dumped. And the liberal and socialist opposition, the opposition just say, we're going to abandon the hall of parliament in protest, and then the forces of order, the monarchy, you have that. You always have these structures, the church, the military, the industrialists say, oh dear, where are we going to go now without him? And these calculations are made, and January 30s there. So I think there becomes a kind of a second moment, which you want this consolidation, where in fact starts doing things that could never even have been imagined in an earlier phase, and which we know about only that they are policy from seeing him or seeing that regime in operation. Now, I think these are my sort of latest thinking about this. So one, he basically subordinates politics, meaning the National Fascist Party, to the state. Right? He basically says, you are not in charge at the local level. It's the prefect. Okay, again, the governor, who's appointed by the Homeland Security, in other words, appointed by out of his cabinet, controls the party locally. So the party can no longer be a source of disturbance, beating people up, doing all sorts of awful things, unless it's being told to do that, in other words. And also, it cannot pretend to come to Parliament, which is still operating to rubber stamp decrees, to do politics, to lobby for legislation, to have factions, we want more trade union, less trade union, because it's very easy to try to get power. Start speaking for exiles, socialist exiles. You can have all kinds of factionalism. So he subordinates the party and thereby politicking, to the prefect, so that parliamentary political life becomes pro forma. It no longer is an action thing going on. This is important to understand, if you want, the nature of fascism. Yes, sir.
Does this imply though that then in 1923 the parliament, instead of resisting what's happening, kind of
it collapses under the Matteotti crisis. I mean, no, it's a very illustrious operation through 23, 24, except that he was having a harder and harder time having majority in it. So gets a new electoral law, sounds really great, 2/3, it's a way. It was talked about a lot. Italy wasn't the only place where that was discussed. Great, sort of winner-take-all approach. It's a way of getting complex legislation through. It's not just a fascist invention. But then, when the crisis erupts because somebody denounces it, and denounces it loudly in Mussolini's presence in Parliament, so much that the usual bad guys pick up and say, I think Mussolini wants him killed, and then do it. He can't control the crisis. In the course of that, the Parliament, sitting Parliament that had been is closed, and when it reopens, the deputies to protest go and sit elsewhere. They retreat to the Aventine, which was something that had been done in Roman times. I'm not sure to what effect, but it clearly was a major error, because when Parliament then does reopen, the only people who show up are the communists who get beaten up and thrown out. These small politics, very symbolic. But I think what you want to carry away is when Mussolini in 1925, right, he goes in Milan. So this phrase, excuse me, I can never get it right. Nothing outside the state, everything inside the state. Nothing above the state. But it's very meaningful, but perhaps not. You think of totalitarianism. Something like this great glue, miasma, sort of bringing people into the brain of the leader and the leader into the brain of the people, and nothing can do it. You have no civil society, you have nothing. That's what people talk about Putin that way, as if, he wriggles everybody, or Hitler. No, I mean, society goes on. You've got, politics trying to burst out. You still have everything trying to operate, but now to operate very differently. So when he says that, he's saying it to the businessmen of Milan, who are all sitting in La Scala. Right? And he said, I passed 2,000 pieces of law, and I've made 2,000 decrees. We have total efficiency. But the world is still at war. The world was at war, it's still at war. Italy has to be at war. And therefore, we want to make everything, organize everything in terms of making Italy great and able to fight this war, which in some sense is abstract. It's not as if they're going to go to war. You couldn't trace 1925 to 1940, but it's important in terms of organizing not the politics part, that's important. Excuse me, I'm going to stop then. But all the welfare stuff. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second. We'll talk then about women and the gender questions.
The Nazis, as we'll see next week, organized their state rather differently. Hitler would never have said, everything for the state, nothing outside the state, but rather had sort of competing centers of power. So the party and the state, unclear who had jurisdictions.
Yeah.
They were played off against one another. The military for a while was a source of power as well, in the bureaucracy. Not this kind of image that so many people had in the 50s and 60s of this sort of monolithic totalitarian regime.
So that word, like polycratic, to describe these big interest groups vying with each other.
Yeah.
And I think they've tried to use that model for Italy, because again, you have to think every society, every state will have its own way of administrating power. Again, it's sort of an open question. Thinking of the American constitutional structure, the federalism, the power of the executive, the power of the courts. Where is power? And it's a big question. Where is the power? And is it local? Is it national? Is it federal? And so on and so forth. And in Italy, they tried the polyarchic thing. And I think the most recent conclusion, which is pretty darn boring, is that there's a lot of continuity with the liberal state. A lot of not time servers, do civil servants, more and more politicized, more and more having to have the party card, some better, some worse, a lot of policing, a lot of spies, who would sort of integrate things, using the existing structures, the church, and the kind of loyalty that the church engenders. That's terribly important for the stabilization. One of the most important pieces of change in coming back to the so-called non-political side. So I would argue, you look at the politics, and it's been that structure of factionalism, of debate, of representation has been pretty much eliminated. And if it exists, it's not coming through there. It's not coming through the electoral system, the political system, not even through the party system. There's real control over the party. There are little shuffles and so on. But what becomes the other part is this, Michel Foucault uses this word governmentality. And what's interesting is it doesn't depend on the vote. It's much more ideas of governance, which are often new, and which are around, let's say, religiosity, around health, around procreation. So it's about the reproduction of the society. How do you reproduce it? And that foregrounds gender, and it foregrounds also colonialization, and puts them together. So the line in Italy is a prolific people. It needs space. It needs living room where they can go settle. The more people, the better. So forget eugenics. Forget interventionist genetics. Positive eugenics is good. The more children, even if they're, especially if they're born out of wedlock, love children are supposed to be very special. Just let it rip with children. Okay, really, and that is so. If that's the model, very prolific, country which is supposed to then use those people to settle both internally and externally. Okay. Lots of things happen as a result, ways of thinking. Well, Italy already did not have abortion, and which goes back to the Catholic nature of the country at unification, and no divorce, which was really backward because a contract, make a contract, break it. But so what he does as early as 1927 is he begins to lay out a kind of total program for improving what they call the stock, like animals, race, or the race. Okay, it's the notion of the race, like a stock, breed stock. So women should have as many children as possible, and you should give family incentives to do that, tax breaks. Men should do their duty. Okay, Italian men, especially the middle classes, had trouble holding jobs. They didn't marry until they were about 45 because until they had their degrees and diplomas. So they had middle classes declining. So penalizing men, put a tax on celibacy, which he then said we would pay. Listen to this; it sounds familiar. We used to pay for the mother and children's support system, which would take the babies who were illegitimate and their mothers and put them in nursing homes so where the babies could be nursed until they were weaned, and then the mother bye-bye, and the kids would either be adopted or go with the mother. The mother would be found a job, or somebody to give her a handout, or to whom she would prostitute herself. But then the brothels closed down, on the street traffic, full of disease, create official brothels, which were policed. All the prostitutes then would be off the street, and they would be in brothels. So system closed down all the bars. 1926, they go around and close all the bars. Open up good, clean bars where people can go in. Police, workers' recreation, and so on and so forth. So, and then more and more colonization. Build new plant farms, get rid of the mafia, which was regarded as a problem of malcostume, of criminality, not necessarily the top guys, but all the little guys who were arrested by the thousands in raids in 1926-27, all brought down with their sheep to be held in concentration camps outside of the city of Palermo. Ditto in Libya, round up all the Bedouins who prevented colonization, probably killing maybe 140,000 of them, putting them in concentration camps. They were called that. Concentration had a hygienic notion in Italian. So you can see in this state the end of politics as we traditionally understand, but also the beginning of these forms of governmentality, which the fascists are pursuing with more and more clarity. What makes them fundamentally different from the Nazis is it being a Catholic country. The science was also heavily imbued by what they called Latin eugenics, which meant that you didn't interfere in the body. You're not allowed to kill people, because sterilize them, and choose them, select them eugenically as a good partner, and this was very important. They regarded that as fundamental. It's very interesting difference, with the argument that you got better stock by having sort of everything flow. That was the sort of
Did,
idea.
in fact, their pro-natalist policies work? I mean, in terms of, because this is a challenge of all regimes that suddenly embark on pro-natalism. Can you get particularly middle class or working class families who have made the transition from high mortality and high fertility to low mortality, low fertility, who don't want to have many kids, to ever have more? What the Nazis discovered is that by their vast marriage loan scheme, they could get more people to marry and have one or two kids, but it simply made up for all the people who didn't get married during the Depression or were married and didn't have kids. And the overall rate of population increase didn't increase at all.
Nothing I found showed that it worked. It increased numbers of marriage and lowered the age of marriage, which is interesting. But and it probably actually had the better care for infants. At least meant more infants survived, but that wasn't until 1940. A huge increase in welfare stuff during the war, World War II. But I think it changes, the idea of young women, particularly at a time where more and more were going into the job market. They were pushed into only certain kinds of jobs. There was a big change in Italy in 1919, so there was a real counter-revolution against feminism after the fascists came to power, because they were supposed to get the vote, and the fascists initially supported it, and then the fascists said, okay, we'll give you the vote at the local level, and then they eliminated elections at the local level, but they put in directives saying women couldn't be lawyers. That is, they could get law degrees, but they couldn't apply to the national exams, would put you on the register. And so you would end up having to work as a lawyer in somebody's firm without being able to go to trial, take things to trial. That was a big, and ditto with doctors. You could get your doctoral degree, but you couldn't take the exam, so it had you as a doctor in the hospitals. So eventually they got women like that could go to the empire because they desperately needed them. So there's a lot, it's this pressure, because, abortion, and abortion became a crime of state. It had just been a crime before that, a civil crime, but then it became a crime against the state. Did it decrease abortion? There's no sign that it did, but it probably made them more difficult and more political. If, a big fascist leader had a girlfriend had an abortion, her family could maybe blackmail him. That's the sort of terrible sorts of things. With all, the question about, a long time book about how fascism ruled women, and I made a lot of assumptions about it being so much against women's interests that no women supported. I mean, really, the regime, and I think that's not so. I mean, especially as we have more and more photographic material, I was stunned by how many young women decked out as fascists in 1921, 22, especially in Milan. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. And then huge, enormous, beautiful photographs on all the women who are organized in fascist organizations, with the idea it's not political representation, but there you are represented on the stage of history. And that wasn't so under the liberals. This is the first time that you are representing the nation, in your
and you are
bodies.
given a kind of recognition and a chance to participate. And that's something we'll come back to when we'll talk about some of the readings for next week, that the opportunities to participate, to enjoy, to exert power of however minimal a sort, were so abundant in these regimes. And, often hard to resist.
When they found some material about the what was the name of the women's organization in Germany,
The Frauenwerk.
Yes, but what's the head of it that Claudia wrote about? The
Oh, Gertrude Schultz-Klink?
yeah, it's Gertrude Schultz. And so she was very young, about 34. And she had these beautiful blonde braids. And so when she came down to Italy, they say, oh, you know, she's Hitler's girlfriend. And so that, I mean, the aura, you know, I mean, misinformation, but, you know, the aura of this, you know, Brunhilde, this goddess, this blonde goddess, who looked like some of the actresses of the times. And, you know, so she was representing Hitler, and, you know, of course, in the hierarchy, she hardly existed. But these were often women who, they built up these big women's organizations, and the problem was training them. So to train gymnastics teachers, they set up a school and turned out thousands of young women to be gymnastic teachers. So new, you know, when they're part of, you know, for the youth organization, the peasant organizations relatively later. Well, it was very important for the women to get special money for dowries, and so you organize, you know, chicken festivals or eggs to bring to market, or weaving baskets, so the women would be able to come, you know, and sell their embroidery or make exchanges and get these small amounts of money. So that's these are extremely important sort of moves of recognition, integration. You know, every once in a while you get an ex-bourgeois feminist that says, well, yeah, can't you give us a little more voice? But, you know, who has voice? You know, clearly the voice was. But ultimately, when they needed female representation later on in the 30s, you know, some of these fascist parliamentary types who were in the cabinet, they had amazing wives who would speak 5 languages, and the one that became the head of the Italian, who would you send to Germany? This woman who's a daughter of famous textile magnate, and she, you know, a princess in her own right, she would become the emissary. So, you know, unfortunately, it's very complicated, and the abortion wasn't fascist, but making it a state crime was. The divorce, that wasn't fascist, that was prior, but no question Mussolini's agreement with the Pope, which in 1929 in effect created a theocracy in Italy. You know, the liberals said free church and a free state, and the Pope would never sign on to that, boycotted it, the entire liberal state. Mussolini comes along and, okay, free church and unfree state. And, you know, 1929, the one thing that the Pope insisted on, no abortion and no divorce. Okay, crucifix in the school, and religion classes and all of the classrooms of Italy, but the most important thing was the stuff around the family.
Whereas in Germany, abortion was illegal, as it had been before. They just kept paragraph 175, or 218. No, 218 is the abortion. But selectively enforced it. That is to say, they would sometimes force the foreign workers who came into Germany to the tune of 11 million in the course of World War II. Women, if they were pregnant, they would be forced to have abortions. Jewish women were encouraged to get them. And divorce remained legal, in part because the regime, with its racial thinking, wanted to encourage Aryan men, quote unquote, Aryan men or women who were married to Jewish men or women to divorce their partner.
You had a question.
Oh, yeah, no, just quickly, I wanted to ask, were the fascists the one who made, women not allowed to practice law or
Yes, those were decrees passed under the fascists,
and
right?
what was the rationale? Because they should stay home and have children?
Well, that was a general, so they wouldn't compete with men in professions that were, I mean, that was the logic, that they should, yes, that they should stay home and have children was it, but the real thing was about, the inequality in the job market. How do you deal with, but most of the laws were always connected to problems of need. So in the late 1930s, for example, the state, because it was going to war more and more, was hiring more and more personnel. And veterans were coming back from Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War. So clearly what the bureaucrats wanted was all these, young women, life of the office, knew how to type, nice legs, and all that stuff, kind of. And so the regime introduces a decree saying preference has to be given to veterans. And in some, but, that it's not so clear. It created a big ruckus. And it's not so clear, again, how that worked in the end, whether, because the job market, in some sense, always ends up pushing in different ways.
In Germany, it pushed differently, or they dealt with the problem of many feeling that there were not enough opportunities as a lawyer or a doctor or certain civil service positions. Less pushing out women, although they did that some with the civil service, than firing Jews.
Yeah,
and pushing them out of those professions.
Yeah,
and then that created room for men. But then when men came to prefer party careers or joining things like the SS or getting drafted into the Wehrmacht, then they suddenly really needed. Germany faced acute labor shortages by the late 30s. So they were encouraging more women to come and work. Middle-class women. Working-class women always worked. That, because there are certain industrial jobs and domestic service jobs that are so coded female that you're never going to get men to do them. So it was a question when they talk about women being pushed out, it's middle class and upper middle class women who are the question.
It's a very confusing misunderstanding that women are pushed out of the job market. Quite the contrary. I mean, wages dropped so much in the textile industry that perforce the only people who would take it were women. And then in addition, they had to build all of these dormitories and churches and gyms, which the owners then said, oh, aren't we benevolent? Because they had all the young women that needed to be taken care of, who would come down from their mountain homes. And so they'd have to be taken care of and be paid very low wages and kept in there. So these systems sort of operate. Sometimes you say making the worst choices, making the most inequitable choices, and also larding it with really poisonous ideological motives. That talk about the benevolence of the industrialists or the benevolence of Mussolini, giving out birth prizes or group marriages, or taking care of the orphans of the empire and so on. But again, that's important to know, to understand, and say, well, what's fascist about this?
Earlier you mentioned the family being a core part of the education system. Was there a national education system, or was it sort of local? Was it through the church at this point?
Oh no, Italy had a functioning, better and better functioning public school system, and the fascists did intervene, but first the nationalists intervened. A very prominent nationalist who became a fascist, Gentile, they, to rethink the system so that you would create better hierarchy, social and cultural hierarchy. So in the lowest level, you'd have the kids, learning to read and keep themselves clean, and then third grade, a lot of them would leave, and then sixth grade, more would leave, and then you get to, in fact, a great number would leave, and then some would go on to be tracked into technical schools and so on, or women's college, women's schools, and then this elite, something called gymnasium, lycée, which would create your elite. And their big idea, which didn't get put through, was to create a women's elite system, and they never did that. So it stayed men and women together. So you create pretty strong women through that system by the late 1930s, and ditto through the fascist organizations. Women move around in them. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
One, two, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. Earlier you mentioned how the fascist party was unique in that it was different. It branded itself as different. It wasn't a young conservative party. It set out to be different. And part of the appeal with the futurist movement that it allied to in Italy, at least, with architecture and the fine arts, was that vision of new and vision of the future. I'm wondering how early on did that become like explicit policy from the higher levels of the Italian fascist party?
Well, the future, Marinetti, who was the founder of the futurist movement, he was at San Sepolcro. I think him and his wife. So, there was that component of futurism, war is the way of the world, we're going to break with the arts of the past and the architecture of the past. We're going to create, again, this idea of the new man who would, be vigorous and hardy. How many children he was going to have wasn't so clear, but this is sort of the notion of this, the warrior man. Contradiction between warrior man and animal man who's supposed to be, producing babies at home. There is that, and that becomes more and more visible by the second generation, the late 1930s, or what's with denunciations of the bourgeois man and his, shmoo-like behavior, doing nothing and having no values and no militarism and not even having children. Okay? Whereas the workers, they just wanted to work and didn't want to go off and settle in the empire.
Italy always has struck me, know much more about Italy than I, as having embraced itself as a modern, future-oriented movement. It had a vision. It wasn't, it looked back to the glories of imperial Rome and was going to be an empire. But Hitler was much more ambivalent. It was on the one hand recuperating, some of the dreadful traditional architecture and, clothing and looking back to the sort of, blood and soil rural. But on the other hand, really pushing industrialization, embracing kind of the sort of aspects of modern society necessary to wage war. And embracing certain things, like have any of you seen Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will? The opening scene where he's flying in an airplane. This is the modern man sweeping down, recognizing, traditional old Nuremberg, but presenting, himself as new and his subjects all militarized, whether they were the Hitler Youth or, the Reichslabor Service or whatever, It was all very, these are the new men and women and the new people's community.
The use of the media, which is, the documentary form, propaganda form, which is becoming more and more used since the war and centralized by the fascist regime and hugely grown in Germany, which begins to set the pace in the 1930s. And it, it's capable of using the image, in the case of the Duce, the Führer, in an extraordinary range of ways. Mussolini threshing with peasant women, sort of a man of the people, but more like a Paul Bunyan figure, vigorous, down to earth, naked, half naked, or on the horse. That's already a kind of stranger image, a little awkward in his uniform as a corporal of the empire, the glory of good horsemanship, sort of atavistic idea, but he takes that up, and then, in his car, racing car, skiing, or, then all, the modern figures. So there is this idea of sort of the imaginary Mussolini where he can play to all, Mussolini the father, sort of all, everything to everybody. With a lot of contradictions, and you say, well, I'm going to be that and that as well. With very able photographers and directors who know how to deal through censorship with the images, and that's very, very kind of important part of the consolidation of the regime, and also then to bringing in images. clearly the change in the way young women are portrayed from the late 1920s are kind of small and dark and like not great posture, and then by the late 1930s they all look like Leni Riefenstahl, long legs, blonde, whatever, and differently muscled. But that was probably true up to a point. That is, in the sense that you probably got the provincial kids of some of these federali in the 1920s, who were sort of all amateurish, and by the 1930s, different diet. The children of the elite in the front lines, the different use of photography. There was a lot of influence also from Russia. The realism, the high contrast, and so these are kind of national figures, and it's a significant transformation and an effort to amalgamate then the image. It's one of the things we have a hard time doing as historians is moving back and forth between the past and the present, because the media was used so differently then, but it was so advanced with respect to how politicians and people were shown before World War I. And such a difference too between the 1920s and the 1930s. So the idea of totality, seeing all these marching bodies, is of the 1930s. You rarely get that you don't have that in the 1920s because they're not marching in line yet. That's a product of the school systems, the after-work organizations, the youth organizations, where you get everybody much more and more martial. Okay? And that's probably a question we want to talk about maybe a little bit next when we go to the war. And so I think it would be. You had a question,
It's really brief. I was just wondering why you think their pro-natalist policies didn't work. And I think it's an interesting question because clearly they're doing so much. They're banning abortion, they're increasing marriage. The book even talks about a tax on celibate men, which I thought was fascinating. But it's just an interesting question of a fascist state using all its tools of biopower and then it not working. And just surprising.
I know, it blows the mind, but
But it is part of this commitment to thinking, this is the influence of eugenics from the pre-war, thinking of improving the national community, improving the race so it can then go forth and conquer territory. With the irony, of course, being saying, we need Lebensraum, we need living space because we don't have enough, but we better have more people, which then gives us, the more pressing necessity to conquer other territories, whether it's the overseas empire that features so strongly in the Perfect Fascist, or the continental empire that the Nazis were creating in Eastern Europe.
So maybe just you ask a question. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
And then I'll.
Oh, I was going to say too. When you go to those years leading up to the war, World War II, like 1930s, late 1920s, do you feel like you could kind of measure the wave of the popularity with the German and Italian citizenry to the state, where it was like, we really love the state, we have this participation in this fascist state? Or would you say it was kind of the same as a lot of countries where there's like a significant portion of the population that supports it? There's a lot of people who hate it. There's a lot of people who are kind of just indifferent to it. Again, then after World War II, is there a lot of guilt from supporting this thing? It's because with the citizenry, it's something that they don't really teach in public schools. I feel like in the United States, it's more just about Hitler, Mussolini.
Yeah, it's a very profound, a big question, and also a deep question about what a lot of debates in Italy. How much consent was there to fascist rule? And consent is a word usually used in a liberal society where you can say, I consent and I don't consent. Yeah. Or my opinion is, okay, or not, or expressed through vote, or expressed through jokes. Then you can start going, jokes, scrawls, viva, La Rivoluzione, down with Mussolini, things, graffiti, police overhearing stuff. It's really difficult, and I can tell you because when I was younger, I said, there's really a lot of dissent. You know, I could see workers everywhere saw dissent.
We had the
19
decades of our romance
Yeah,
with sort
yeah,
of
there
not organized resistance, but what the Germans called resistance, ways of opting out of the regime, dissenting.
Yeah,
But you know,
closing off in the family, and that's, you know, sort of not participating. Okay, you know, that's once the wars are
the war
in
changes
Italy.
everything.
See, I didn't really ever study well the Ethiopian War, 1936. We're going to talk so briefly. So Mussolini decides about 1932. There's no global disarmament. You've got the Depression. Italy now has to act on its empire. Okay, where is it going to act? In an idea of Euro-Africa and the Balkans. Those are the soft areas. But especially Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia happened to have an empire, and it was in the League of Nations. But Mussolini argued it wasn't up to the standard of civilization it was supposed to have, because the Negus, the emperor, still permitted slavery in the south, which was true. I mean, permitted it or whatever, it was hard to get rid of. So he says, we're going to take this, and we're going to do it fascist-like. No declaration of war, which would admit that they had a government or a state, without the permission of the League, even though Germany and France are trying to give it away to him. He wants a war with the militia. Okay, I'm going to use the militia, not the army. Fat chance. I mean, initially, okay, they're not very well trained. We're going to do it, by war, and it's going to be a fast war, which means a huge amount of preparation because there are no roads in Ethiopia, so you have to build the roads as you get to the capital, Addis Ababa, which is in the middle of, not nowhere, it's on a nice high plain, but it's definitely inland. And finally, settle. And we're going to settle. Okay, now this is a big problem, the settling. We're just going to deal with that to bring anti-Semitism together with bodies and so on. Yeah. That immediately this army being put into this people, they don't even know how many, they're about 13 million they discover after years of, they start raping and pillaging and having babies, little dark babies. And this becomes a huge problem back in Italy and Europe generally. Okay? And Mussolini stepping back says, oh, we're being accused once more of being dark, black peoples, like, we are treated in the New World, Italian labor along with slave labor in the 1900s. Okay. Two, the bar has been upped in Europe with the Nazis about the race question, who's Aryan and who's Latin, and are Aryans better than Latins, or Latins better than Aryans, and so on. Race question is now a big deal. Okay. And what's more, he's discovering, the Jews, they were supposed to help us in this war by talking to the Rothschilds and telling the Rothschilds not to sanction us. And there were sanctions, so there's a huge ruckus about the sanctions. So all of a sudden, the problem of Italian racial quality is being called into question by this assault on the Ethiopians. So Italy begins to immediately introduce a real apartheid system, which other countries, were always trying to do, British, God knows, India and so on, but a legal apartheid system which says these black people cannot mingle with whites, and the whites will be punished if they mingle with the blacks. And it's first for the empire, but then, as Hitler puts in the race laws, the Italians say, we're going to do one better. Okay, not only can they not mingle sexually, except for pleasure and under confined things, they can't marry, which the Nuremberg laws didn't say you can't marry.
No, it said both no sexual relations and no marriage.
And no marriage. But you can't.
No sex and no marriage.
Okay, so, true. Okay, in Italy, I'm sorry. Okay, absolutely right. In Italy, there's a problem there because under natural law, under Catholicism, the state can't decide who you marry. I mean, the church doesn't allow that. So the Pope is going to, apparently, he says he's going to have Mussolini break the Lateran Accords if the Jewish legislation goes through, he calls upon an American expert on racial law in the United States to draw up a document in 1938 which would expose Italian racism as bad on natural law as well as social and other reasons. And then, unfortunately, he dies, the Pope, and this document never gets produced. But so Italians are going for the anti-Semitism in a totally broad way, broader in some sense than Nazi Germany, because they've introduced apartheid laws in the colonies themselves. And then this creates a certain kind of backlash. They go forward with it the same, removing all the Jews from businesses, from the universities. The first to go are the school children, and this is organized by the Minister of Education, Botai, who's considered the best and the brightest of all fascists, like a kind of McNamara of fascist Italy. And he says, well, we've got to be very serious about this. We've got to eliminate them before the schools open, otherwise it will create too much disruption. So the children, even before the degrees are passed in September 1938, are excluded. The Jewish kids are excluded from schools, from kindergarten through university. So I'm not saying getting the same outcome, but as of 1938, this is a planned, thought through, legally,
and
carefully,
very fast, much faster than the Germans did it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then they kept correcting the legislation over the next 3 or 4 years. The upshot is that the Jews are expelled from society, and they're excluded from most operations from society, but they're not outlawed. Okay. Yeah. Anyway,
Are they still technically citizens? Because the Nuremberg laws made Jews non-citizens.
They're still citizens, but with no.
And was their property Aryanized in the way?
Property. Yeah. So they're citizens without. Anyway, we'll come back to this because we should close up.